the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. Rosie Caravos has worked for the Pan Pacific Toronto Hotel for 17 years. She was part of a booming, bustling, multi-billion-dollar hospitality industry that many say now resembles a ghost town.
Everything is bare bones. Like, they're working with limited staff. Yeah, it does feel empty. I'm used to going in now. Things are, I gotta go look for whoever the manager is, because even some of the managers are not back full time, or they've had to carry on other jobs. Like, I've had to go outside and find another job because the bills are coming. This is not paying my bills.
She is one of the thousands of workers devastated by the brutal impact of COVID-19 on Toronto's hotel and service industry. Others finally saw the glaring inequities that the pandemic amplified. Many never came back.
It was hard not seeing them and speaking to them, and it's like now it's just like, have they moved on? Because a lot of them probably won't be recalled back due to the business capacity, right? It's going to take time. The hospitality, I think, is one of the last industries that will probably recover.
So what will it take to recover a loss of more than $8 billion, according to Destination Toronto estimates? And almost 2 years in since the first mass lockdown, will the industry ever be able to bounce back to pre-pandemic highs? The Star's real estate reporter Tess Kalinowski reported on this, spoke to Rosa and other industry insiders, and she joins me now to explain. Hi, Tess. It's nice to have you on the podcast again.
Hi, Saba. It's nice to see you. Well, I can see you and I can hear you. That's nice.
It makes for a nice change these days. So yes, definitely, Tess. So I want to talk to you about your recent piece, and I guess I want to know if it's fair to say that we've improved a little since last year when hotels were being used as homeless shelters. And can you tell me a little bit about what was going on during the height of this pandemic? And I do believe that's kind of what led you to reporting on this.
Yeah, so I think some hotels are still being leased as housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. But we got to talking to one of the owners of the hotel. I think it was the Bond near Yonge Dundas Square. And I was doing this story with Victoria Gibson, my colleague, and we were asked to look into, whether or not there would be enough hotels in the city if the city bought some up to use as housing. And the reason that was my end of the story, and I was investigating that because we'd heard there was a concern among some city councillors at the Planning and Housing Committee recently that if we used hotels for housing, we wouldn't have enough as convention destinations, which are super important economically to the city. And it had come up before. I covered a very long tribunal on the city's Airbnb rules. And that was a point of concern among some of the people who testified there. So I was sort of interested to know how our hotel rooms stocked up. As it turned out, I immediately found out this is not a concern at this time because, of course, nobody's using hotel rooms. Well, not nobody, but the hotel trade is in serious trouble. In fact, some hotels just closed down at the peak of the pandemic. They used the time to renovate, or they simply just didn't operate because nobody was traveling. You couldn't move. And because some of the provincial regulations didn't permit it.
So what's been the damage like? What kind of losses are we talking about financially? And it's interesting that you brought up the convention destination aspect of it as well, because if you look at Toronto, we've been talking about the tourism industry, but the other aspect of it must have been hit hard too, like the rest of the world. So can you talk to me a little bit about how bad it's been?
Well, I think the city suffered an $8.35 billion loss as a result of the death of the visitor economy here. So that gives you an idea of how big a loss we're talking about. Across the region, it was $14.3 billion. It's a staggering amount of money. Now, I don't know exactly how they define the region. We have a lot of attractions and a lot of places where people meet. And we have a lot of suburban hotel nodes, places like the airport and Markham. And, in places like Oakville or Burlington, you get them by the side of the 401 or the side of the QEW. So there are lots of areas that are impacted. But according to Destination Toronto, we lost 463 events were canceled last year, during the pandemic. And we lost millions in taxes at all levels of government, like $205 million were lost in municipal taxes, $711 million for the province, and $528 million in the federal realm. And the number of visitors, one chart had 27.5 million visitors a year to Toronto normally, 4.5 million more, 44.5 million to the region. So it's huge. It involves about 70,000 jobs and $3.1 billion in wages. So you can imagine not just the hotels and establishments, but the workers have felt this deeply.
Right. And you mentioned jobs and wages. And throughout this pandemic, we've talked about how there's been a disproportionate and terrible effect on those who've been at the lowest rungs of the ladder. So you're talking about a huge number here. How did this impact the workers in this industry? I know you talked to a few, right?
Yeah. So what I heard, Saba, was that it's extreme instability for a lot of them. So initially, they were all sent home. Some of them opened up here and there. I led off the story with a woman named Rosie. And Rosie told me that I'm sure by the time we got between March 2020 and today, she had been sent home and brought back to work at least 3 or 4 times. But now she's back. She's only working part-time, and it's meant that she has to get a second job. The other thing that struck me is how much these people actually liked working in the hotel industry. I talked to a guy named Donald Fogelbach, and Mr. Fogelbach was telling me, what a fun place, that people were in a good mood. They were upbeat because they were serving guests, or they were guests and they were traveling and they were mostly feeling good. So those are dearly loved jobs. And a lot of them are unionized jobs, which is interesting to me. So these people make about $22.50 an hour for sort of working in a laundry or as a dishwasher or a cleaner. And let's see, about 32,000 of them are unionized, I understand. And most of those unionized jobs are in the downtown. So those jobs have some security and some heft to them, and they've really been extinguished in a lot of ways.
So a lot of those people, are they coming back because we know that there's been a labor shortage in the service industry because of the instability during the pandemic? A lot of people just stopped working in these sectors. Is it a similar situation here, though?
Well, the workers told me that the people I talked to all went back, but they said a lot of their colleagues did not. They didn't expect to ever see them again. They were moving on to other jobs, out to other provinces. And I spoke to Frederick Dimanche, who's the head of hospitality at Ryerson. They have a hospitality school there. And he was telling me that this is a real challenge because, especially at a time when we're challenged to find workers in that sector, people are really becoming aware of what they want in their work lives. In any other kind of industry or category, many people would be saying, you know what, I want to work from home more. I want to tailor my hours more to my life. And here's an industry that is always so short for labor, and the way it has treated its labor has often not been as forgiving of things like childcare or just respecting of your personal hours. And as you can see from the provincial legislation that Ontario is looking at, there's a real awareness that people are entitled to have a private life, that people's mental health has to be guarded. And that's a really tough thing for this industry to provide. It hasn't traditionally, but it's something that workers are increasingly wanting and demanding, in fact. And when they're in demand, I just saw a story that Starbucks has had to put up its wages, right? Because they can't find people to work.
Right. The work culture is shifting drastically as a result of what we've seen in the last 2 years. Okay, let's talk about recovery. It's been almost 2 years since the first lockdown. What kind of prospects are there for Toronto's hotel industry to come back to perhaps close to pre-pandemic levels?
So when I spoke to Scott Beck, and he's the CEO of Destination Toronto, that's the agency that markets Toronto for visitors, he was saying that, one good thing about the crisis is underlying it, everything that made Toronto so attractive prior to the pandemic is still here. We still have safe streets, wonderful transit, lots of great amenities, but it's going to take a while for that to come back. And CBRE that's a commercial real estate industry organization. They do a lot of research. They were looking at sort of 2026 before we kind of are well established in recovery. And I think most people think it's just a matter of time. But one thing we need in the interim is more certainty in who can come to our city and what they need when they get here by way of a vaccine passport. Somebody at the Board of Trade was telling me that they had friends that flew to France. They got a passport on the plane. It was a very simple process. When they landed in France, they could go absolutely anywhere showing this one single piece of paper. And so Lindsay Broadhead, who was the Board of Trade VP I was speaking to, she was saying, we don't have that here. At that point, interprovincially, we didn't have something that worked. Canada has since brought that out. But still, there's a lot of uncertainty about how that works crossing our Canadian border.
We'll be right back. So I take it the opinion is there needs to be a little bit more than the recent federal announcement on vaccine travel passports, right? But more of a regularization and easier process to help with this, right?
Yes, I think people are looking for something that's bureaucratically easy. People don't understand when they need to get tested, whether they're coming or going, what's different on land than in the air. And I think there's a case to be made that until some of this becomes kind of normalized, that it's going to be very hard to get people to plan a convention for 1,000 delegates if they don't really know how those people are going to move about the city or get in and out of the country or the province.
That makes sense. We keep talking about this pandemic and we say a lot of stuff that is unprecedented has taken place, but we do have a sort of similar experience during SARS as well, because I know you spoke to the senior VP of Toronto's Trade Board, and she also kind of talked about the comparison, right, of what the city went through during SARS and the kind of way it impacted the economy. Can that kind of help us see what could happen here?
Well, yeah. And she talked about the two kinds of risks. There's the more direct risk, the immediacy of restaurants that can't really function, hotels that are empty, that sort of thing. But she was more concerned about the long-term risk. It took a long time for Toronto to be established as an international destination. And, somebody said that having the UP Express from the airport was a big step because it allowed people to come to the city and easily get downtown. But along the way, we've sort of accumulated some reputation and credibility, and enough people have been here and enough people of influence and significance that they are drawing investment to the community. And one of the things that Lindsay Broadhead was saying she fears is that some of that reputation and some of that desire to invest in Toronto could be lost as a result of this sort of lag. I mean, Lindsay and Jan De Silva, who's the president of the Board of Trade, she was saying that it really stuck out in their minds that the New York Times had written a story that called Toronto the most locked down city in North America. And that was a reputation they feared would stick for a long time. That's the thing they're most concerned we avoid.
And it's really interesting to me how you also talked about the Toronto market was kind of at its peak before COVID-19 hit in terms of being a hub for conferences and events and business conventions. I actually didn't know that because I always considered it from like a tourist hub angle. So we were hitting a peak from this convention destination point of view as well.
Yeah. So the convention business, from what Mr. Beck told me and from what Terry Mundell at the Greater Toronto Hotel Association was saying, this is a really competitive business. I mean, when you're wooing a convention with several thousand delegates, that brings a lot of money to the city, as we previously mentioned. And you've got a lot of really top destinations competing. So, yeah, it's really lucrative and it's really important. The other thing is we have also a lot of business travelers that come, to do sort of business within their company, not part of a big convention. And then we have sort of the tourists. But the thing about that is both those kinds of travel, the business and the convention travel, feed into the tourism, right? Because you know yourself, if you've been to New York on business or Chicago or San Francisco, you got lucky enough to go there for a weekend, you really want to go back and check out other things. You want to share it maybe with a spouse or your kids. Or, if you come here, maybe you didn't get to Niagara Falls and it's an easy ride, but maybe you can go there. So it's all kind of interconnected in that respect.
And that might be more of a concern now that we know this entire in-person work culture is kind of going through a major shift and shifting to digital and virtual. So that kind of leads to whether the business or convention-focused market could ever actually bounce back.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions about that. And because we're not there yet, we don't really know. I mean, the Ryerson prof, Frederick Dumonge, was saying that he doesn't think conventions and meetings are going anywhere. He thinks they'll continue. But there's no question that people who live their lives, and a lot of these people work in sales or they have sort of global jobs, they have spent their lives traveling, not knowing what time zone they're in, living in airports out of suitcases, and they've had a chance to stop. And they might not be so keen to go back to that kind of road warrior, he called it, lifestyle. So maybe they are, going to trim it by 1 or 2 trips a year. Not all of them, but maybe out of 10, they're going to only take 8 or 6. And that would impact the industry big time. But we don't really know that yet.
And you talked to some workers at the Pan Pacific, and one of them said something that stuck with me, that it seems like a ghost building, even now, 2 years since COVID struck. So, what does that say about the future of Toronto's hotel, convention, and tourism industry?
Well, I don't know that okay, so we're coming in, we're not going to know this for a while, I don't think, but we're coming into the really slow season in the hospitality industry. I think what Mr. Fogelbach was saying was, November through January are just, if you've ever been near a hotel at Christmas time, for example, it's not really jumping. It's pretty sedate. Most people gravitate to home, and these days, most people are gravitating to home anyway. And so there's a real fear that, like, for some places that are on the margins, they might not make it through this traditionally slower season. I mean, they're already sort of on their knees, and getting on their feet is really hard. And now they're going to face the hurdle of the traditionally slower business time. So it seems sad. Like Donald was saying, he used to work with another person all the time. Now there's just no need. There's just him in the laundry a lot of the time. There's no food service in the hotel. So Rosie was saying she doesn't have that many dishes to wash, and hence her hours are cut back. It really sounds kind of bleak.
I guess we'll have to wait till Toronto's famous summers to see if some of the crowds come back.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your insight, Tess. It's always great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Saba. It's nice to talk to you.
I was talking to the Star's real estate reporter, Tess Kalinowski. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Sabai Tazaz. The This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bucknick, Raju Muther, and Sean Pattington. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattington. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.